Hello everyone. My name is Jonathan Navas, and today we'll be discussing the ethical issue of whether society has a moral obligation to reduce poverty and social inequality through government action. This issue is important because poverty is not only about having a low income, it also affects access to education, healthcare, stable employment, and many of the opportunities that allow people to improve their lives. In this presentation, I will explain the background of the issue, present both sides of the debate, apply different ethical theories, and finally explain which position I believe has the strongest moral justification. Before deciding whether governments have a moral obligation to reduce poverty, we first need to understand what poverty really means. Poverty is much more than not having enough money. It often limits access to quality education, healthcare, safe housing, transportation, and stable employment. Because of this, many people begin life with disadvantages that make it much harder to succeed. For example, imagine two students attending the same college. One can dedicate it all of their time to studying, while the other has to work long hours every week just to help pay rent and buy food. Both students may be equally intelligent and hardworking, but their opportunities are very different. This idea is connected to social mobility, which means a person's ability to improve their economic situation over time. Philosophers such as Henry Luther argue that a just society should create fair opportunities for people who are born into disadvantaged circumstances. However, others believe governments should be careful because public assistance can sometimes reduce person responsibility or create dependency if programs are poorly designed. For that reason, the ethical question is not whether poverty exists, but whether reducing it should be considered a moral responsibility. So we can respond the first position and say yes. The first position argues that society does have a moral obligation to reduce poverty and social inequality. The first reason is that people do not choose the conditions into which they are born, because these disadvantages are often outside an individual's control. Governments can help reduce barriers by investing in education, healthcare, transportation, and employment opportunities. A simple example is public education. Most people agree that every child should have the opportunity to attend school, regardless of how much money their families has. Supporters of government actions believe that same principle should apply to other basic opportunities that help people improve their lives. The second reason is that if governments have the ability to reduce preventable suffering through effective policies, many philosophers argue that choosing not to act becomes morally difficult to defend. The goal is not simply to provide financial assistance, but to create opportunities that help people become independent. Okay. On the other hand, there are also important arguments against this position. One argument is that moral obligations should have reasonable limits. Governments have limited budgets and many responsibilities, including education, healthcare, public safety, and infrastructure. Because resources are limited, helping one area often means spending less in another. Another concern is that not every government program is successful. Some programs reduce immediate suffering but do not improve education, employment, or long term independency. Critics argue that the best policies are those that help people build the skills and opportunities they need instead of creating permanent dependency on government assistance. So now I will analyze this issue using four ethical theories. The classical utilitarianism asks Which action creates the greatest happiness for greatest number of people? Since poverty affects millions of individuals, reducing it can increase overall well-being. However, totalitarianism also reminds us that government programs should produce real results rather than simply spending public money. Preference. Preference utilitarianism focuses on satisfying people's most important preferences. Basic needs such as healthcare, education, housing, and safety are more important than less essential preferences. Because of this, I believe this theory provides a strong support for reducing poverty while still considering the interests of society as a whole. The other theory is the deont- deontological ethics based on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, which argues that every person has inherent dignity and deserves equal moral respect, since no one chooses the circumstances into which they are born. Helping remove unfair barriers respects that dignity. Finally, the theory of the virtue ethics asks what a compassionate and responsible society would do. It encourages virtues that has justice, generosity, and responsibility, suggesting that society should help people while also encouraging them to become independent. So, as a conclusion, after examining both sides, I believe that the first position has the strongest moral justification. Personal responsibility is important, and governments should always use public resources wisely. However, many people begin life facing disadvantages that they did not choose. Because of this, I believe society has a moral responsibility to reduce those barriers and create fair opportunities for everyone. Among the ethical theories we studied, I believe preference utilitarianism offers the most balanced solutions because it recognizes that different groups have different interests, while giving greater importance to basic human needs such as education, healthcare, and safety. At the same time, I agree with one important criticism from the opposite side. Government programs should not only provide temporary assistance, they should also promote education, employment, and long term independency so that people eventually have the opportunity to succeed on their own. To conclude, after researching this topic, I realized that poverty is not only about money, it is also about opportunity. It affects people's ability to study, find stable employment, receive healthcare, and build a better future. For that reason, I believe this issue is not only an economic debate, but also a moral one. Thank you very much for listening.